A millionaire ran me over. When he got out of the car, I was in shock. He had the exact same birthmark as my son who disappeared 20 years ago. The real surprise came when another identical man stepped out of the car. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. The screech of brakes was the last thing I heard before everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the cold asphalt, my grocery bags scattered around me like confetti at a funeral. My hip throbbed with a pain that shot down my leg, and my hands were scraped raw from hitting the pavement. But none of that mattered the moment I saw him. A man in an expensive suit was kneeling beside me, his face etched with genuine concern. "Ma'am, please don't move. I've called 911. They're on their way." I tried to focus on his words, but my eyes were drawn to something else entirely. There, on the left side of his neck, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark. My breath caught in my throat. It was identical to the one my Tommy had. Exactly the same size, the same shape, the same location. "Tommy." The word escaped my lips as a whisper, barely audible. The man frowned, leaning closer. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "My name is David. David Morrison." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. 20 years had passed, but that birthmark, I would recognize it anywhere. I had kissed it goodnight 1,000 times when Tommy was little, traced it with my finger when he couldn't sleep. "I'm so sorry about this," David continued, his voice thick with guilt. "I didn't see you crossing. The sun was in my eyes and, David, we need to get her medical attention now." Another voice interrupted, and I turned my head to see a second man approaching from a black Bentley parked askew in the middle of the street. My world tilted on its axis. He was identical to David. Not just similar, identical. The same dark hair, the same green eyes, the same strong jawline. And when he knelt down on my other side, I could see it. The same crescent-shaped birthmark on his neck. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a sob, something, because both men looked at me with renewed alarm. "Ma'am, you're in shock," the second man said gently. "Try to stay calm. Help is coming." "Twins," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. "You're twins." David glanced at his brother. "Yes, we are. I'm David, and this is my brother Daniel. But right now we need to focus on getting you help." "Daniel." "David. Not Tommy. But those birthmarks. Identical birthmarks on identical twins. The odds had to be astronomical." "How old are you?" I asked, my voice growing stronger despite the pain coursing through my body. David looked confused by the question. "We're 25. But ma'am, I really think you should save your energy." 25. Tommy would be 25 now. He disappeared when he was 5, 20 years ago. The math was perfect. Terrifyingly perfect. "Where were you born?" I pressed, struggling to sit up despite their protests. "Ma'am, please," Daniel said, gently placing a hand on my shoulder to keep me still. "You might have a concussion. You need to rest." But I couldn't rest. Not now. Not when I was looking at two men who could be my son. Sons I never knew existed. The ambulance arrived with a wail of sirens, but I barely heard it. Paramedics surrounded me, checking my vitals, asking questions I answered automatically while my mind raced. David and Daniel stepped back to give the medical team room, but I kept my eyes locked on them. As the paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher, I heard David talking to someone on his phone. "Yes, it was my fault. I'll take care of all the medical expenses, of course. Full coverage, whatever she needs." The kindness in his voice reminded me so much of Tommy. My little boy had always been gentle with hurt animals, always the first to comfort a crying child at the playground. "Wait," I called out as they wheeled me toward the ambulance. Both men turned toward me. "Please, I need to ask you something important." Daniel walked over to the stretcher. "What is it? Were you adopted?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I saw something flicker across Daniel's face, surprise, maybe recognition. David remained expressionless, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Why would you ask that?" Daniel said softly. "Because 20 years ago my 5-year-old son Tommy disappeared. And he had a birthmark exactly like yours." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the paramedics paused their work for a moment. David's face had gone pale, while Daniel stared at me with something I couldn't quite identify. "Ma'am," David finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "you've suffered a traumatic accident. Sometimes these experiences can cause confusion, false memories." "I'm not confused," I interrupted, my voice firm despite the tears streaming down my face. "I've spent 20 years looking for my son. I know what I'm seeing." Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but David grabbed his arm. "We need to let the paramedics do their job," he said curtly. "Daniel, get in the car." "But David." "Now." As the ambulance doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of them standing by the Bentley. Daniel was looking at the ambulance with an expression of deep confusion and something else. Longing, maybe. David was pulling him toward the car, his body language tense and urgent. The paramedic checking my blood pressure smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, ma'am. The gentleman who hit you seems very concerned about making sure you're taken care of. He's following us to the hospital." But as we pulled away, I wasn't thinking about David's generosity or my injuries. I was thinking about 2 identical birthmarks, 2 men the right age, and the way Daniel had looked at me when I mentioned adoption. For the first time in 20 years, I felt something I'd thought was dead and buried. Hope. But hope, I'd learned, could be the most dangerous emotion of all. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. I'd been here for 6 hours, and the doctor said I was lucky. Just a bruised hip, some scrapes, and a mild concussion. Lucky. The word felt hollow in my mouth. David had been true to his word. He'd handled all the paperwork, spoken with the doctors, even arranged for a private room. But every time I tried to talk to him about the birthmarks, about adoption, he deflected with concern for my health and promises that we'd discuss everything once I was feeling better. Daniel was different. He lingered in the doorway when David wasn't looking, studying my face with an intensity that made my heart race. I could see questions forming behind his eyes, the same questions that had been tormenting me for 20 years. Now, as evening shadows stretched across the hospital room floor, I was alone with my memories. The accident had cracked something open inside me, and all the carefully buried pain was spilling out like blood from a reopened wound. I closed my eyes and let myself remember that day, July 15, 2004. The date was burned into my soul like a brand. We'd gone to Riverside Mall for back-to-school shopping. Tommy was so excited about starting kindergarten in the fall. He'd been chattering nonstop about making new friends, learning to read big kid books, riding the school bus. His little hand was warm in mine as we walked through the crowded corridors. "Mommy, can we get ice cream after we buy my backpack?" he'd asked, his green eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Of course, sweetheart," I'd replied, squeezing his hand. "But first we need to find you some new shoes." The children's department at Macy's was chaos. It was late July, and every parent in the city seemed to be doing last-minute school shopping. Tommy was getting cranky, overwhelmed by the crowds and noise. I was exhausted too. I'd worked a double shift at the diner the night before, and my feet were killing me. "I need to sit down for just a minute, baby," I told Tommy, spotting an empty chair near the dressing rooms. "You can look at the light-up sneakers right over there. Don't go far, okay? Stay where I can see you." He nodded eagerly and ran the few feet to the display of children's shoes, immediately fascinated by a pair that blinked red and blue when he pressed the heel. I sat down and rubbed my aching feet, keeping one eye on Tommy while I dug through my purse for some aspirin. The store was so loud, crying babies, arguing parents, the constant chatter of shoppers. I was getting a headache, and the fluorescent lights weren't helping. I must have closed my eyes for 30 seconds, maybe a minute. When I looked up, the shoe display was empty. "Tommy," I called, standing up so quickly that my purse spilled all over the floor. "Tommy." Other shoppers turned to stare as I frantically searched the immediate area. The light-up sneakers were still there, one of them blinking forlornly on the floor where he'd dropped it. "Tommy," I screamed, pushing through the crowd, checking every rack, every corner. A store employee heard me and called security. More people joined the search. The mall went into lockdown. But Tommy was gone. The police arrived within minutes, but those first few hours were a blur of questions I couldn't answer and accusations I couldn't defend. How long had I looked away? Why wasn't I holding his hand? Had I noticed anyone suspicious? Did I have enemies? Was my ex-husband involved? Mike, Tommy's father, had left us when Tommy was 2, claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibility of parenthood. He sent birthday cards sporadically and saw Tommy every few months, but he was living in Phoenix by then, building a new life with a new girlfriend. The police checked his alibi. He was at work, hundreds of miles away. The security footage was useless. Too many people, too many blind spots. One camera caught Tommy walking toward the main corridor, but after that, nothing. He'd simply vanished into thin air. The media attention was brutal. Nancy Grace featured our story, painting me as either a grieving mother or a negligent parent, depending on the news cycle. Strangers on the internet debated my guilt in comment sections. I couldn't stop myself from reading. The whispers followed me everywhere. At work, at the grocery store, at church. That's the mother who lost her child at the mall. Can you imagine being so careless? Mike came back for exactly 3 days before declaring that he couldn't handle the pressure and returning to Arizona. He's probably dead, Jean, he said with characteristic bluntness on his way out the door. You need to accept that and move on. But I couldn't accept it. I couldn't move on. I quit my job and spent every waking hour searching. I printed thousands of flyers with Tommy's picture, drove to every city within a 500-mile radius, contacted every children's organization and missing persons group I could find. I maxed out my credit cards, lost my apartment, moved in with my sister until she couldn't take my obsession anymore. You're destroying yourself, Sarah had said after I'd spent our grocery money on a private investigator who turned out to be a fraud. Tommy's gone, Jean. You have to let him go. Let him go. As if love had an expiration date. As if a mother could simply choose to stop hoping. I'd been working as a cleaning lady for the past 10 years, taking night shifts so my days were free for searching. I lived in a tiny studio apartment, drove a car that was older than Tommy would be now, and spent every spare penny on gas money and private investigators who promised results they couldn't deliver. My friends stopped calling. My family stopped asking about the search. Even the police detective who'd been assigned to Tommy's case had moved on to fresher tragedies. I was a 59-year-old woman with no husband, no children, no life outside of an obsession that everyone else had declared hopeless. But today, everything had changed. A soft knock on the hospital room door interrupted my thoughts. I opened my eyes to see Daniel standing in the doorway, alone this time. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He pulled up a chair beside my bed and sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "David doesn't know I'm here," he said without preamble. "He thinks I've gone home. But you didn't." "No." He met my eyes. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. About your son. About adoption." My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Daniel, I've always known I was adopted," he said quietly. "David and I both were. But we were adopted by different families when we were 5 years old. We didn't even know about each other until we were 18. The room seemed to spin around me. Different families? David was adopted by the Morrisons, wealthy family, big house in the suburbs. They already had 2 biological children, but they wanted to do something charitable. I was adopted by the Hartmans, middle-class family, very loving. They couldn't have children of their own. "When you were 5, I whispered. 20 years ago." "Yes." His voice was barely audible. "July of 2004. July 2004. The same month Tommy disappeared. Do you remember anything from before?" I asked, my voice shaking. "From before you were adopted?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Fragments, maybe. I remember being scared. I remember crying for someone. A woman with brown hair who smelled like vanilla. I remember another boy who looked just like me, and feeling like part of me was being torn away. Vanilla. I'd worn the same perfume for years, until I couldn't afford it anymore. The adoption agency told both of our families that we were orphans," Daniel continued. "They said we'd been found together, but that it would be better for our development if we were separated. That twins sometimes become too dependent on each other." "What was the name of the agency?" "Bright Futures Adoption Services." "But Jean." He looked up at me, and I saw my own desperate hope reflected in his eyes. "They went out of business years ago. There was some kind of scandal, financial irregularities. All their records were sealed. Bright futures. I'd heard that name before, during one of my many conversations with social workers and missing children advocates. But every time I tried to get information, I'd hit a wall of bureaucracy and sealed records. I need to ask you something, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And I need you to be honest with me. Daniel nodded. Do you remember the name Tommy? His breath caught. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, slowly he nodded. Yes, he whispered. I remember that name. I used to call out for Tommy in my sleep when I was little. My adoptive parents thought I had an imaginary friend. The world tilted around me. 20 years of searching, 20 years of hope and despair and crushing disappointment. And now this. A stranger with my son's birthmark, my son's age, calling out for Tommy in his sleep. I think, I said carefully, I think Tommy might have been your twin brother. Daniel closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with tears. I think so too. I was discharged from the hospital the next morning with Daniel's phone number, tucked safely in my purse, and a promise that we'd meet again soon. David had been noticeably absent during the discharge process, sending his assistant instead with a bouquet of expensive flowers and a note that read, "Wishing you a speedy recovery. Please don't hesitate to contact my office if you need anything." Cold. Professional. Nothing like the warm concern he'd shown at the accident scene. But Daniel had been different. When he'd helped me into the taxi, he'd squeezed my hand and whispered, "I'll call you tonight. We need to figure this out together." Now I sat in my cramped studio apartment, staring at the wall that had become my shrine to Tommy over the years. Photos from his first 5 years covered every inch, his first steps, his third birthday party, the day he learned to ride his bike without training wheels. But it was the missing poster that dominated the center, the one I'd hung there 15 years ago and never taken down. Missing. Thomas Michael Chen. Age 5. Last seen at Riverside Mall. Chen. That had been my married name. The one I'd kept even after Mike left because it was Tommy's name too. But looking at Daniel, I wondered if my son even remembered being Tommy Chan. Or if 20 years with the Hartman family had erased that part of his identity completely. My phone rang at exactly 7 o'clock, just as Daniel had promised. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle with concern. "Sore, but better. And you? How are you handling all this?" There was a long pause. "I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about what you said, about Tommy being my twin brother. I've been having these dreams for years, nightmares, really, about losing someone important. Someone who looked like me." My throat tightened. "I'm sorry. This must be overwhelming." "It is, but also relieving in a way. Like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place." He took a deep breath. "Jean, I need to tell you about my family. About how I grew up." I settled back against my worn couch cushions, preparing myself for whatever he was about to share. "The Hartmans are good people," Daniel began. "Really good. My dad, my adoptive dad, worked as a high school math teacher. My mom was a nurse. They weren't wealthy, but they made sure I had everything I needed. Love, stability, encouragement. They put me through college even though it meant taking out loans they're probably still paying off. A bittersweet ache filled my chest. Part of me was grateful that my son, if Daniel truly was my son, had been loved and cared for. But another part of me felt robbed of those precious years, those milestones I'd missed. They knew I was adopted, obviously, but they never made me feel like I was anything other than their son. When I started asking questions about my biological family as a teenager, they were supportive. They helped me contact the adoption agency, but like I told you, all the records were sealed. "What about David?" I asked. "When did you find each other?" "That's a longer story." Daniel's voice grew troubled. "I was 18, just starting college. I was working part-time at a coffee shop near campus when this guy walked in who looked exactly like me. I mean exactly. Same face, same build, same everything. We just stood there staring at each other like we were looking in a mirror. I could picture it perfectly. Two young men seeing their reflection in a stranger's face, the shock and confusion and instant recognition. At first we thought it was just a crazy coincidence." Daniel continued. "Doppelgangers, you know? But then we started talking, and we realized we were both adopted, both the same age, both from the same agency. It didn't take long to figure out we were twins. How did David react to finding you? Another pause, this one heavier than the first. Differently than I did. I was excited, thrilled to finally have a piece of my past, a connection to where I came from. But David was more cautious, suspicious, even. Suspicious of what? Of me, I think. Of my motives. His adoptive family, the Morrisons, they're very wealthy. Old money, you know? They own a chain of luxury hotels across the country. David grew up with every advantage money could buy. And I think he was worried that I was some kind of con artist trying to get close to him for financial gain. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a cleaning lady living in a studio apartment, and my son was worried about gold diggers. But you stayed in touch? We did. But it's been complicated. David built walls around himself early on, and he's never really let me pass them. We see each other maybe once a month for dinner, exchange Christmas gifts, that sort of thing. But we're not close. Not the way I always imagined twins would be. And he's never shown any interest in finding your biological family? None whatsoever. He says the past is the past, and that the Morrisons are his real family. He gets uncomfortable whenever I bring up our adoption or ask if he remembers anything from before. That explained David's cold reaction at the hospital, his quick dismissal of my questions. He didn't want to remember where he came from because he was comfortable with where he'd ended up. Daniel, I said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Do you think David might remember more than he's letting on? About your life before the adoption? The silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally Daniel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes. I think he remembers a lot more than he admits. Sometimes when we're together, I'll mention something, a smell, a sound, a feeling, and I see this flicker of recognition in his eyes before he shuts down. Like he's deliberately choosing not to remember. My heart ached for this son who'd been searching for his past while his twin brother actively ran from it. What about his adoptive family? Have you met them? Oh yes. The Morrisons are intense. Very focused on image, on maintaining their social standing. David's adoptive mother, Patricia, she's never liked me much. She thinks I'm a bad influence, too common for their family's standards. She barely tolerates my presence at family gatherings. Family gatherings? David insists on including me in some Morrison family events, even though it makes everyone uncomfortable. I think it's his way of trying to have a relationship with me without actually opening up. We can be brothers in public, but we can't talk about what that really means. I closed my eyes, imagining my two sons, one raised in luxury but emotionally distant, the other raised with love but forever searching for something missing. Both of them carrying pieces of trauma they couldn't fully remember or understand. Jean. Daniel's voice pulled me back to the present. There's something else. Something I haven't told you yet. What is it? David has a son. A 4-year-old named Marcus. And Marcus. Daniel's voice caught. Marcus looks exactly like we did at that age. Like the photos in the missing person reports I've seen online. My breath stopped. A grandson. I had a grandson who looked like Tommy, who carried the same genes, the same family resemblance that had skipped a generation and reappeared in this little boy I'd never met. I've only seen him a few times, Daniel continued. David keeps his family very separate from the rest of his life. But when I do see Marcus, it's like looking back in time. He has the same green eyes, the same stubborn cowlick that no amount of hair gel can tame. Does David know about the resemblance? He'd have to be blind not to notice it. But if it bothers him, he's never said anything. David's gotten very good at compartmentalizing his life, keeping different parts separate so they don't interfere with each other. I thought about that my son who'd learned to lock away inconvenient truths, who'd built a successful life by refusing to look backward. It made sense in a way. If acknowledging his past meant acknowledging that he'd been stolen from his mother, that his entire identity was built on a lie, then denial was probably easier. Daniel, I need to see him. I need to talk to David face to face, tell him what I know. Jean, I don't think that's a good idea. David doesn't respond well to pressure. And if he feels cornered, I'm not going to corner him. I just need him to know that I've been looking for him, both of you, for 20 years. I need him to understand that he wasn't abandoned or unwanted. He was stolen. The word hung between us like a physical presence. Stolen. That's what it was, really. Someone had taken my children and sold them to the highest bidders, erasing their history and mine in the process. If you're determined to do this, Daniel said slowly, then I want to be there with you. David might be more willing to listen if I'm there to support you. Would you do that? Even though it might damage your relationship with him. Jean, Daniel said, and for the first time since we'd met, his voice was completely steady, completely sure. If you really are my mother, then David needs to know the truth. Both of us deserve to know where we came from, no matter how painful it might be. I closed my eyes and felt tears sliding down my cheeks. After 20 years of searching alone, I finally had an ally. Someone who understood what it meant to carry pieces of a broken past, who knew what it felt like to be incomplete. Thank you, I whispered. Don't thank me yet, Daniel said with a shaky laugh. We still don't know how David's going to react. But whatever happens, we'll face it together. Together. It was such a simple word, but it felt like the most precious gift I'd received in 20 years. The week that followed my conversation with Daniel was a whirlwind of research, phone calls, and sleepless nights. We decided to gather as much information as possible before confronting David. And what we discovered was far worse than either of us had imagined. Daniel met me at the public library downtown on Thursday morning, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by barely contained anger. I found something, he said without preamble, sliding into the chair across from me. Something that's going to change everything. I leaned forward, my heart hammering. What is it? He opened the folder and pulled out several photocopied documents. I contacted a friend from law school who specializes in adoption law. She helped me dig into Bright Futures Adoption Services, the agency that placed us. The first document was a newspaper article from 2008. Local adoption agency shuttered amid fraud investigation. I scanned the article quickly, my stomach churning as I read about falsified documents, illegal placement fees, and children placed with families who'd paid premium prices for healthy, young children. This is from 4 years after we were adopted, Daniel said, his voice tight with controlled rage. But the investigation went back at least a decade. They were operating illegally for years before they were finally shut down. What kind of illegal operations? Daniel pulled out another document. This one a court filing. They were taking children from desperate families, single mothers, families in financial crisis, and telling them their children would be placed in loving homes through legal channels. But they were also stealing children outright and creating false documentation to make the adoptions appear legitimate. My hand shook as I took the papers from him. The legal language was dense, but the implications were clear. Bright Futures hadn't just been cutting corners. They'd been running a sophisticated child trafficking operation disguised as an adoption agency. Daniel, this means Tommy wasn't just lost at the mall, he finished grimly. He was taken. Deliberately. By people who knew exactly what they were doing. The room seemed to spin around me. For 20 years, I'd blamed myself for taking my eyes off Tommy for those crucial seconds. I'd carried the guilt of his disappearance like a stone in my chest, convinced that my moment of inattention had cost him his life or freedom. But this changed everything. There's more, Daniel said, pulling out a handwritten list. I managed to track down 3 other families whose children were placed through Bright Futures around the same time we were. 2 of them agreed to talk to me. He handed me the list, and I saw 3 names with dates beside them. Jennifer Walsh, July 2004. Michael Santos, August 2004. Lisa Chong, September 2004. All of them had children who disappeared under suspicious circumstances and were later adopted through Bright Futures. Jennifer Walsh's daughter vanished from a park while she was playing with other children. The police assumed she'd wandered off and gotten lost, but no body was ever found. 3 weeks later, a 4-year-old girl matching her description was placed with a wealthy family in Connecticut through Bright Futures. I felt sick. And the others? Michael Santos was a single father whose 3-year-old son was taken from their apartment while he was at work. The babysitter claimed the boy just disappeared. But there were no signs of forced entry. Lisa Chang's twin daughters. Twins? I interrupted. Yes. Twin girls age 6. They disappeared from a school playground during recess. Lisa always suspected they'd been taken. But the police treated it as a runaway case because the girls had behavioral issues and had talked about wanting to live somewhere else. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. Jean, I think Bright Futures specifically targeted twins. Twins are harder to place through legitimate channels because most families want single children. But they're also more valuable on the black market because they're rarer. So they separated you and Tommy to make you easier to place. And to reduce the chances that we'd ever find each other or trace our origins. Two identical children placed with different families in different social circles. The odds of us crossing paths naturally were minimal. I stared at the documents spread across the library table, trying to process the magnitude of what we'd discovered. My son hadn't been lost because of my negligence. He'd been stolen by criminals who built a business around destroying families like mine. Daniel, we need to go to the police with this. He shook his head. I already tried. The statute of limitations has run out on most of these cases, and Bright Futures principals either died or disappeared years ago. The detective I spoke with was sympathetic, but he said without new evidence or witnesses, there's nothing they can prosecute. So they just get away with it? The organization was shut down, and several people went to prison. But for the families who were separated, for the adoptive families who may not have known they were participating in trafficking, there's no legal remedy. I felt a familiar surge of helpless rage. The same feeling I'd battled for 20 years whenever another lead went cold or another investigation hit a dead end. What about David's adoptive family? The Morrisons? Do you think they knew? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. That's what I'm afraid to find out. What do you mean? Jean, the Morrisons paid nearly $100,000 for David's adoption in 2004. Even adjusted for inflation, that's an astronomical amount for a standard adoption. Most legitimate agencies charge $20,000 to $30,000 at most. The implications hit me like a physical blow. They paid premium prices for a stolen child. Either they paid premium prices knowing he was stolen, or they were wealthy enough that Bright Futures targeted them specifically as clients who could afford to pay extra for a special placement. Special placement? Daniel pulled out one more document. This one a receipt with official letterhead. I found this in some old papers David had in storage. It's a payment receipt from Bright Futures to the Morrisons, dated July 2004. It specifically lists the adoption fee as a priority placement premium for exceptional candidate. I read the receipt 3 times before the words fully sank in. Exceptional candidate. As if my 5-year-old son was a luxury item being sold to the highest bidder. Daniel, if the Morrisons knew, if they paid extra knowing that David was stolen, then David has been living with people who were complicit in his kidnapping. I know. His voice was barely above a whisper. And if they didn't know, if they were just wealthy targets who got manipulated by skilled criminals, then David's entire sense of identity is built on a lie either way. We sat in silence, the weight of our discoveries settling over us like a suffocating blanket. I thought about my son, both my sons, living with families who'd either knowingly participated in their trafficking or been unwitting accomplices to it. We have to tell him, I said finally. David deserves to know the truth, even if it destroys his world. I agree. But Jean, you need to be prepared for how he might react. David's entire sense of security comes from his relationship with the Morrisons. If we force him to confront the possibility that they're not who he thinks they are, he might choose to reject the truth rather than face it. Exactly. And if he does that, we might lose any chance of having a relationship with him. I looked at Daniel. This son I'd found after 20 years of searching, and saw my own determination reflected in his eyes. Then we make sure we don't lose each other again. No matter what David chooses. Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. There's one more thing we need to discuss before we approach David. What? DNA testing. We've been operating on assumptions and circumstantial evidence, but if we're going to confront David with accusations this serious, we need scientific proof that we're actually related. Of course. In my emotional state, I'd been so focused on the birthmarks and the timing and Daniel's fragmented memories that I'd overlooked the most obvious step. You're right. We need to know for certain. I've already arranged for testing at a private lab. We can get results in 72 hours. Daniel squeezed my hand. Jean, are you prepared for the possibility that the test might be negative? That despite everything we've discovered, I might not actually be your son. The question hit me like a slap. I'd been so certain, so desperate to believe that I'd finally found Tommy, that I hadn't allowed myself to consider the alternative. I've been searching for 20 years, I said slowly. I've chased false leads, been scammed by fake psychics, convinced myself I'd found him a dozen times only to have my hopes crushed. If the DNA test is negative, it'll just be one more disappointment in a very long line of them. But I don't think it will be negative. Too many things fit, Daniel. The timing, the agency, your memories, the birthmarks. And more than that. I paused, struggling to find the right words. When I look at you, I see my son. Not just physically, but in your mannerisms, your kindness, even the way you hold your head when you're thinking. I see pieces of myself and pieces of the little boy I lost. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I see it too. When you told me about Tommy disappearing at the mall, I had this flash of memory, being in a crowded place, feeling scared and lost, calling for someone who never came. It felt real in a way that my other childhood memories don't. Then we do the test, and we prepare to confront David with the truth. And if he rejects us? If he chooses his adoptive family over his biological one? I thought about that question, really considered what it would mean to find my sons only to lose one of them again to denial and fear. Then at least he'll know that he was loved, I said finally. That he wasn't abandoned or unwanted. That somewhere in the world, his mother spent 20 years looking for him and never gave up hope. Daniel smiled through his tears. That's all any of us can really ask for, isn't it? To know that we were loved. As we gathered up the documents and prepared to leave the library, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years. A sense of impending resolution. Whether the DNA test confirmed my hopes or shattered them, whether David embraced the truth or ran from it, at least the searching would be over. I'd spent 2 decades in limbo, trapped between hope and despair, never knowing what had happened to my son. Now finally I was going to have answers. The question was whether I'd be strong enough to handle whatever those answers turned out to be. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was scrubbing bathroom floors at the Morrison Hotel downtown, one of the luxury properties owned by David's adoptive family. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally cleaning up after the people who might have stolen my son. Miss Chun. The voice on the other end was clinical, professional. This is Dr. Martinez from Gene Tech Labs. Your DNA results are ready. My hands went numb, and I nearly dropped my phone into the toilet bowl I'd been cleaning. Can you tell me over the phone? I can give you the basic results, yes. Are you ready? 20 years of searching had led to this moment. I sat down heavily on the bathroom floor, my back against the cold tile wall. I'm ready. The test confirms a 99.97% probability that you and Daniel Hartman share a parent-child biological relationship. Congratulations, Ms. Chun. He is definitely your son. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor. 20 years of wondering, hoping, grieving, and now I knew. Daniel was Tommy. My baby was alive, had been alive all this time, living just 2 hours away from me. I picked up the phone with shaking hands. Doctor, are you still there? Yes, ma'am. I imagine this is quite emotional for you. What about the other test? The hair sample we submitted. We'd managed to get a hair sample from David's brush during a visit to his office. Daniel had created a pretense about needing to use David's private bathroom and had carefully collected several strands. The results for David Morrison show the same parent-child relationship. Both young men are your biological sons. Both of them. Tommy and the twin brother I'd never known existed. After decades of having no children, I suddenly had 2 grown sons, plus a grandson I'd never met. I thanked Dr. Martinez and hung up, then immediately called Daniel. Gene. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anxiety. Did they call? You're my son, I said, tears streaming down my face. Both of you. The tests confirm it. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard Daniel's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like sobbing. "Daniel? Are you okay?" "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with tears. I've spent my whole life wondering where I came from, who I really was. And now I know. I have a mother who never stopped looking for me." We both cried then, mourning the 20 years we'd lost and celebrating the fact that we'd found each other at all. When we'd both composed ourselves, Daniel asked the question I'd been dreading. "What do we do about David?" "We tell him. Today, if possible." "Jean, I need to prepare you for how this might go. Yesterday, I tried to bring up our conversation at the hospital, and David shut me down completely. He said you were clearly traumatized from the accident, and that I was being manipulated by a woman desperate for family connections." My heart sank. He's already decided I'm lying. It's worse than that. He's convinced himself that even entertaining the possibility is somehow betraying the Morrisons. When I mentioned that we looked alike, he said lots of people have similar features, and that I was seeing patterns that weren't really there. "But Daniel, we have proof now. Scientific proof." "I know. But David has spent 20 years building his identity around being a Morrison. He's not going to give that up easily, even for DNA evidence." We arranged to meet at Daniel's apartment that evening. He would call David and ask him to come over for dinner, claiming he had something important to discuss. I would be waiting there when David arrived. It wasn't the most elegant plan, but after 20 years of searching, I was done with subtle approaches. Daniel lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, comfortable but clearly within a teacher's budget. The contrast with David's luxury lifestyle was stark, and I wondered how that disparity had affected their relationship over the years. I arrived an hour early and helped Daniel prepare dinner, though neither of us had much appetite. We were both too nervous, too aware that the next few hours would determine whether our family would be reunited or permanently fractured. "He should be here any minute," Daniel said, checking his watch for the 10th time. "Jean, are you sure you're ready for this?" Before I could answer, we heard a car door slam outside. Daniel looked out the window and nodded grimly. "That's him." My heart hammered as footsteps approached the front door. This was it, the moment I'd been imagining for 20 years. I was about to see my other son, the one who'd grown up in luxury while his twin struggled in a middle-class family, the one who'd been raised to believe his past didn't matter. The doorbell rang, and Daniel went to answer it. I stayed in the kitchen, listening to their conversation. "Hey David. Thanks for coming." "Of course. You said it was important." David's voice was warm but cautious. "Something smells good. I made that pasta dish you like. Come on in." I heard footsteps entering the living room, then David's voice again, sharper this time. "Daniel, why is that woman here? The one from the accident?" My stomach dropped. He'd seen me through the kitchen doorway. "David, please sit down. We need to talk." "No, I'm not sitting down. I'm leaving. I told you that woman was unstable, and now you've brought her into your home?" "Daniel, she's obviously targeting our family for some kind of..." "David, she's not targeting us." Daniel's voice was steady but firm. "She's our mother." The silence that followed was deafening. I could picture David standing frozen in the doorway, processing what he'd just heard. "What did you just say?" "I said she's our mother. Her name is Jean Chan, and 20 years ago, her 5-year-old son Tommy disappeared from a shopping mall. We were adopted 3 weeks later through an agency that was later shut down for child trafficking." "That's insane." David's voice was getting louder, more agitated. "Daniel, you can't seriously believe. I have DNA test results that prove it." Another silence, this one even heavier than the first. I heard David's sharp intake of breath, then his footsteps moving away from the kitchen. "You had me tested without my knowledge?" "I had a hair sample tested, yes." "David, we needed to know for sure. You violated my privacy. You violated my trust." David's voice was cold now, controlled in a way that reminded me of his adoptive mother's behavior at the hospital. "How long have you been planning this? How long have you been working with this woman to..." "David, stop." I couldn't listen to any more. I walked into the living room, my hands shaking but my voice steady. "I'm not working with anyone, and this isn't a scheme. I'm a cleaning lady who's spent 20 years looking for her missing son. That's all. David stared at me, his green eyes, Tommy's eyes, filled with anger and something that looked like fear. I don't know what you want from me, but I don't want anything from you, I interrupted. I just want you to know that you were loved, that you weren't abandoned or unwanted, that somewhere in the world, your mother never stopped looking for you. Patricia Morrison is my mother, David said coldly. She's the one who raised me, who supported me, who gave me everything I needed to succeed. Some stranger with a sob story doesn't get to walk into my life 20 years later and claim. I'm not claiming anything. My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I'm stating facts. You were stolen from me when you were 5 years old and sold to a family who paid premium prices for a healthy, young child. David's face went pale. That's a lie. Daniel stepped forward, pulling out the manila folder we'd prepared. It's not a lie, David. I have documentation proving that Bright Futures Adoption Services was running an illegal operation. They were stealing children and selling them to wealthy families. Even if that's true, which I doubt, it doesn't change anything. The Morrisons didn't steal me. They adopted me legally. They paid $100,000 for your adoption, I said quietly. That's 3 times the normal fee for a legitimate adoption. They either knew you were stolen, or they chose not to ask questions when the price seemed too high. David shook his head violently. No, you're wrong. My parents are good people. They're pillars of the community. They support charities. They bought a stolen child, Daniel said bluntly. Maybe they didn't know it at the time, but the evidence is overwhelming. David turned on his brother with fury in his eyes. How can you do this to me? How can you destroy everything I believe about my family, my identity, based on the word of some woman who's obviously delusional? Because it's the truth, Daniel said simply. And because you're my brother, and you deserve to know where you really came from. Daniel, please, I said, seeing the pain in both their faces. Maybe we should give David some time to process this. It's a lot to take in. But David was already moving toward the door. Don't contact me again, he said without looking back. Either of you. I'm done with this insanity. David, wait. Daniel started after him, but I caught his arm. Let him go, I said softly. He needs time. We listened to David's car start and drive away, leaving us standing in Daniel's living room surrounded by the evidence of a family torn apart by greed and lies. I'm sorry, Daniel said, his voice heavy with grief. I thought he might be upset, but I didn't think he'd just walk away. He's scared, I said, sinking onto Daniel's couch. His entire sense of self is built around being a Morrison. If he accepts that he was stolen, he has to accept that everything he knows about his life is a lie. What do we do now? I looked at my son, the one who'd chosen truth over comfort, who'd risked his relationship with his twin brother to reunite me with both my children. Now we respect his choice, and we be grateful for what we have. Daniel sat beside me, and for the first time in 20 years, I put my arm around my child. I love you, I whispered. I've loved you every day for 20 years, even when I didn't know if you were alive. I love you too, Mom, he said, and the word hit me like a physical blow. Mom. I was someone's mother again. Outside, the sun was setting on what should have been the happiest day of my life. Instead, it felt bittersweet. I'd gained one son but lost another, perhaps forever. 3 months passed in a strange new rhythm. Daniel and I met every Sunday for lunch, slowly building the mother-son relationship we'd been denied for 20 years. I learned that he taught 5th grade at an inner-city school, that he'd been married briefly in his early 20s, but divorced when his wife decided she wanted children, and he was afraid he'd inherited some unknown genetic flaw that made him unfit for parenthood. I always worried I'd mess up a kid the way I felt messed up. He told me one afternoon as we walked through the park where Tommy had learned to ride his bike. I didn't know where my behavioral patterns came from, what I might pass on. You would have been a wonderful father, I assured him. You still could be. But our happiness was shadowed by David's absence. Daniel had tried calling his twin brother several times in the weeks following our confrontation, but David's phone went straight to voicemail. When Daniel went to David's office, the secretary said he was unavailable and would remain so indefinitely. He's completely shut me out, Daniel said sadly during one of our lunches. 23 years of being brothers, and he's thrown it all away rather than face the truth. I understood David's reaction better than Daniel did. Perhaps because I'd spent 20 years learning to live with uncomfortable truths. David had built his entire identity around being a Morrison, successful, privileged, legitimate. Accepting that he was actually a stolen child named Tommy Chun would require him to rebuild everything he thought he knew about himself. Some people aren't strong enough for that kind of rebuilding. But life has a way of forcing confrontations, even when we think we've successfully avoided them. The call came on a Tuesday evening while Daniel and I were having dinner at my apartment. He'd been helping me redecorate, adding warmth and color to the sterile space I'd maintained during my years of searching. We just hung a photo of 5-year-old Tommy next to a recent picture of Daniel, marveling at how similar they looked. Daniel's phone rang, and when he saw the caller ID, his face went white. "It's David." "Answer it," I said quietly. Daniel put the phone on speaker, his hand trembling slightly. "David? Is everything okay?" "Daniel, I need." David's voice was strained, exhausted. "I need to see you. Both of you. Can you come to my house?" Daniel and I exchanged glances. David lived in an exclusive neighborhood 40 minutes away, in a house I'd driven past several times during my years of searching, but never had reason to approach. "Of course," Daniel said. "When?" "Now. Please." David's voice cracked. "I have some things I need to say." The drive to David's house was tense and silent. Daniel gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, while I stared out the window at the increasingly expensive neighborhoods we passed through. When we finally pulled into David's circular driveway, I couldn't help but marvel at the house. A massive colonial with perfectly manicured grounds and enough space for 3 families. This was the life my son had been given in exchange for being stolen from me. David answered the door himself, which surprised me. I'd expected a housekeeper or nanny. He looked terrible, thin, pale with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, stepping aside to let us in. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, artwork that probably cost more than I made in a year. But it felt cold and personal, like a museum rather than a home. "Where's your family?" Daniel asked as David led us into an enormous living room. "Rebecca took Marcus to her mother's house," David said, settling heavily into a leather chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I needed some time to think. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and filled with pain. "I hired a private investigator," he said without preamble. "After our meeting at Daniel's, I couldn't stop thinking about what you'd said. So I hired someone to prove you were lying." My heart sank. "And what did they find?" David pulled out a thick folder, identical to the one Daniel and I had compiled. "They found everything you said they would. Documentation of Bright Future's illegal operations. Records of children who were stolen and sold. Evidence that my adoptive parents paid premium prices for a child they knew was probably obtained illegally." The admission seemed to physically pain him. He set the folder on the coffee table with shaking hands. "My mother, Patricia, she kept records. Financial documents, correspondence with the agency. I found them in my father's study." David's voice was barely above a whisper. "There's a letter from Bright Futures explaining that they had a special placement available. Twin boys who would need to be separated, but who were exceptionally healthy and intelligent specimens." Specimens. As if Tommy and his brother had been laboratory animals instead of children. "David," I said gently, "I'm so sorry you had to." "They knew," he interrupted, his voice rising with emotion. "My parents knew that we were stolen. They paid extra for stolen children because they thought it would be easier than going through legitimate channels." Daniel leaned forward in his chair. "What are you going to do with that information?" David laughed bitterly. "What can I do? Confront 2 people who raised me, educated me, gave me everything I needed to succeed? Destroy my children's relationship with their grandparents? Patricia and Harold Morrison are the only parents Marcus has ever known. They're not your real parents," I said softly. "They're the people who bought you." "But they're the people who loved me," David shot back. They may have paid for me illegally, but they gave me a good life. They never made me feel unwanted or different. They celebrated my achievements, supported my dreams, helped me build a successful career. Built on a foundation of lies, Daniel said. So what? David's voice was full of pain and defiance. So what if it was built on lies? It's still my life. My wife, my children, my career. None of that changes just because I know the truth about my adoption. I felt my heart breaking for this son who was so afraid of losing what he had that he couldn't see what he'd gained by finding us. David, I said carefully, I'm not asking you to give up your life with the Morrisons. I'm not asking you to change your name or reject the people who raised you. I just want you to know that you have another family who loves you too. But I don't know you, he said, tears streaming down his face. I don't have any memories of being Tommy Chan. I don't remember you or Daniel or the life we supposedly had together. The only mother I've ever known is Patricia Morrison. That's okay, I said, surprising both him and Daniel. You don't have to remember me to be my son. You don't have to love me the way you love Patricia. I just want you to know that you were wanted, that you were loved, and that somewhere in the world, you have a mother who never stopped looking for you. David stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. You really don't want anything from me, do you? You're not after money or social connections or… David, I'm a cleaning lady who lives in a studio apartment. What could I possibly want from you except to know that you're alive and well? For the first time since we'd entered his house, David smiled. A small, tentative smile but genuine. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to have a biological family and an adoptive family at the same time. You don't have to figure it out all at once, Daniel said. We can take it slow. Maybe start with occasional dinners or phone calls. What about Marcus? David asked. How do I explain to a 4-year-old that Daddy has a new grandmother and uncle? The same way you'd explain any other extended family, I said. Children are remarkably adaptable. It's adults who struggle with complex family situations. David was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with emotions and decisions that would affect the rest of his life. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that reminded me so much of 5-year-old Tommy that my breath caught. Would you like to meet your grandson? He asked quietly. I felt tears spring to my eyes. More than anything in the world. He looks just like Daniel and I did at that age. Sometimes when I watch him play, I wonder if you would have seen the same expressions on our faces when we were little. I'd love to find out. David stood up and walked to a bookshelf, returning with a small photo album. Rebecca made this for Marcus's birthday. It has pictures from when he was born up to last month. He handed me the album, and I opened it with trembling hands. The first photo took my breath away. A newborn baby with a shock of dark hair and the same green eyes that both my sons shared. As I flipped through the pages, I saw Tommy's smile, Daniel's stubborn expression, even my own determined chin reflected in this little boy's face. He's beautiful, I whispered. He's stubborn as hell and too smart for his own good, David said with a father's pride. Just like his uncles probably were at that age. Uncle. David had called Daniel his son's uncle, acknowledging their relationship for the first time. David, I said, closing the photo album carefully, I want you to know that whatever you decide about our relationship, I respect your choice. If you want to keep your distance, if you want to pretend this conversation never happened, I'll understand. And if I want to try, if I want to see if we can build some kind of family relationship without destroying what I already have, then I'll be here, I said simply. For as long as you want me to be. David looked at Daniel, then back at me. I think I'd like to try. Slowly, carefully, but I think I'd like to try. 6 months later, I was pushing Marcus on a swing at the park while Daniel and David grilled hamburgers nearby. It had been a long journey to this moment. Awkward dinners, stilted conversations, carefully negotiated boundaries between biological and adoptive family obligations. David still called Patricia and Harold mom and dad. He still spent holidays at the Morrison family estate. But he also called me once a week, brought Marcus to visit every other Sunday, and slowly began to remember fragments of his life before the adoption. Higher, Grandma Jean! Marcus shouted from the swing, his laughter carrying across the playground. Push me higher. Grandma Jean. The title still made my heart skip every time I heard it. I think that's high enough, sweetheart, I called back. But I gave him one more big push anyway. As I watched my grandson soar through the air, his face bright with joy, I thought about the journey that had brought us all to this moment. 20 years of searching, of grief, of never giving up hope. The accident that had seemed like a tragedy but turned out to be a gift. The DNA test that had confirmed what my heart already knew. The painful confrontations and careful reconciliations that had followed. I'd lost 20 years with my sons, years I could never get back. But I'd gained something too, the knowledge that love really is stronger than lies, that truth really does have the power to heal, and that sometimes the family we choose is just as important as the family we're born into. Daniel joined me by the swings, watching his nephew with an expression of wonder. Do you ever think about what might have been? If Tommy had never been taken, if we'd all grown up together? I considered the question, watching David as he laughed at something Marcus had said. Sometimes, I admitted. But then I remembered that if things had been different, Marcus might not exist. David might not have become the man he is. You might not have found your calling as a teacher. So you think everything happens for a reason? I think we make meaning out of what happens to us, I said. I can't change the past, but I can choose how to live with it. Marcus jumped off the swing and ran toward us, his arms outstretched. Grandma Jean, Uncle Daniel, did you see how high I went? We saw, I said, catching him in a hug. You were flying like a superhero. As the afternoon sun began to set, David loaded the picnic supplies into his car, while Daniel helped Marcus wash his hands at the water fountain. For a moment, I stood alone in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the sounds of my family, my son's voices, my grandson's laughter, the ordinary magic of a Sunday afternoon in the park. I thought about the woman I'd been 20 years ago, standing in this same park with 5-year-old Tommy, never imagining that it would be the last normal day of my life. That woman had been younger, more trusting, convinced that the world was fundamentally safe and fair. I wasn't that woman anymore. I'd learned that terrible things could happen to good people, that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of unspeakable acts, that justice doesn't always prevail. But I'd also learned that love endures, that hope is sometimes rewarded, that families can be broken and rebuilt, that children can come home even after 20 years of being lost. As we walked back to our cars, Marcus slipped his small hand into mine. Grandma Jean, will you come to my birthday party next week? I wouldn't miss it for the world, I promised. And for the first time in 20 years, I knew that I was exactly where I belonged.